Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I thought I would just go ahead and pull an old slideshow for you about Reconstruction. That's a chapter that we're not gonna end up looking at a whole lot. I know I sent you some video on it, and then I know you had a couple of questions from Dora and Evelyn and Linda on Reconstruction, but really. We need, like, as the snow days and COVID has slowed us down through this school year, we really need to get through this a little quicker. So I'm going to go ahead, just play a former slideshow, and this is a very famous picture of Jim Crow. And what this is you'll notice you have the African American. He's a former slave, and he's holding the Democratic ticket. And so he's what's happening here. You can see, white Southern man. He's holding this gun to this African American's head. He's trying to vote, and what happens is, and what Jim Crow really is during Reconstruction, African Americans get citizenship. They get the right to vote, and then white Southerners at this time period make efforts to try and undermine, like, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay, so the 13th Amendment gives African Americans freedom. Slavery is abolished in America. 14th Amendment makes all males born in the country citizens and gives the African Americans basically the right to vote. And then the 15th Amendment um, tries to prevent Jim Crow from happening. And these three amendments are like basically the civil rights amendments, right? Now, that being said, those amendments get undermined in all kinds of ways. So that's what, in some ways, that's what ends up happening with Reconstruction. And we'll never know really what would have happened under Abraham Lincoln. There's a lot of speculation that if he had not been assassinated, because he got the 13th Amendment passed and then started the efforts on the 14th and 15th Amendment, we're assuming that he would have pushed us into, like, a more progressive direction and ensured that, there wouldn't be shenanigans like Jim Crow laws being passed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how that would have happened, but he's assassinated, so we'll never know. What ends up happening, though, is he ends up with his vice president taking over, and his vice president is pretty much I don't want to say he's pro-Southern sympathizer. He was a Southerner, but Andrew Johnson is a man who is not necessarily pro-African American. He's just anti-wealthy plantation owner. And so he like fights efforts for Reconstruction, so to speak. Those efforts being giving African Americans a lot more rights. So the Civil War ended in April 1865 with the Union winning the war. The Union and the Confederacy had to face the challenge of rebuilding, and constitutional amendments made during the period redefined what citizenships and rights were. So again, that's 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment. Political decisions made after the war end up defining the South. Okay, the nation moves towards reunion. So there's, still a lot of bitter feelings. This is the time period where we get the Ku Klux Klan that get formed. And in a way, what the Ku Klux Klan it really originally is it's Southern soldiers. The reason why they dressed in white hoods and white hats is because they're supposed to be the ghosts of the dead and fallen Confederate soldiers, right? And in some ways, it was an insurrection, a movement by former soldiers to kind of rebel against these new radical changes that the North was making. So Reconstruction is an impression, a model, or a reenactment of the past formed from unavailable evidence. From available evidence. Union politicians wanted to bring the South back and reunify the nation. Some leaders wanted to punish the South. So, I mean, clearly, if you're a congressman from the North and you've had sons that died in the war, and there were definitely congressmen that had lost family. Everybody had lost family at this point, and some of them were really wanting to take things harshly on the South. Okay, so the Freedom Bureau aids former slaves. So Lincoln and Congress did agree on the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency designed to aid free slaves and relieve the South's immediate needs. Black and white agents of the Bureau delivered food and health care and began to develop public schools. So we're starting off really like on a positive note. I think essentially Lincoln's plan is we're going to try to make this as painless of a reunification as we can. In fact, not a whole lot of war criminals were tried. The North was afraid to really take to the Supreme Court guys like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis because they didn't want to have to argue in court whether the state had a right to secede or not. They were afraid that the Supreme Court would rule that, yeah, the state actually had the right to secede, and we had just fought a war to keep those states in the Union. So they didn't want to litigate that in court, and so therefore they just didn't try any of the former Civil War generals or politicians. Now, there were a few that were tried, and those were the ones that we consider having committed war crimes, and that's a whole other story, but there was a lot of abuses during the war, and some of those guys did face prison terms for that. So here's a picture of Lincoln getting shot in the head, and that just changes everything because his vice president's Andrew Johnson, a Southerner. And so he has a completely different take on how Reconstruction should be done versus Lincoln. So Johnson favored a plan that restored political power to white Southerners. And this also meant that they had to accept the 13th Amendment. In return, Johnson promised to uphold states' rights. So automatically you're getting kind of a conflict there. So he's saying to white Southerners, you can come back into the Union when you approve the 13th Amendment that frees slaves, but we're going to give you the states' rights to vote on how you're going to free those slaves and what rights you're going to give them. All right, many of the radical Republicans and Republican congressmen disagreed and believed that the Southerners had caused the war. Southern legislatures passed laws to restrict the activities of African Americans. Radicals became more determined to have more harsh policy in the South. What is a radical Republican? A radical Republican were a faction of American politicians within the Republican Party of the United States from around 1854 until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. These are the guys, like when we talk about the party of Lincoln, these are the guys that were really like hardcore, we're going to change things. We fought a war, we won a war, it came at great sacrifice. And so what we're going to do is we're going to push through whether they want it or not. We're going to push through our agenda, and we're going to make the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. All right. President and Congress clash. So Johnson doesn't like this. And Johnson and the radicals in Congress begin to clash repeatedly. As a result, Johnson becomes the first president ever impeached. And so I forget what charges they impeached him on, but basically they felt like Johnson was undermining their Reconstruction efforts. And in part, the 14th and 15th Amendment are created because of Johnson's actions. Then they try to impeach him, and he becomes the first impeached president in U.S. history. Now, remember, all impeachment means is that the Congress says, okay, the president did something wrong and therefore can be put on trial as a criminal. Then it goes to the Senate, right? And the Senate then decides whether to put the president on trial or not. And in every case that we've had impeachment, the Congress has impeached the president. We've had that happen 3 times. Well, I guess 4, because Trump got impeached twice. And each time it would go to the Senate, and the Senate would refuse to hold the political trial, right? Or the criminal trial. The senators don't want to put a president on trial for crimes, and especially if the president is in the same party as you. So in Donald Trump's case, the Republicans were in charge of Senate. The Republican senators did not want to try the Republican president. All right, so impeachment is the act of bringing charges against an official in order to determine whether he or she should be removed from office, right? So you put him on trial as a criminal. If criminal, if crimes are considered have happened, then you can kick that person out of office. So the Senate narrowly voted not to remove Johnson from office, but by that time he had lost control of Reconstruction. So he's become so crippled by the impeachment that he can no longer really take action. All right, the Reconstruction of the South. Radical Republicans redesigned sweeping Reconstruction plans. They divided the South into 5 military districts under the command of Union generals. A condition for readmission to the Union, all the Southern states had to grant the vote to African American men. In 1868, radicals ratified the 14th Amendment that guaranteed full citizenship status and the rights of every person born in the U.S., including African Americans. So the crazy thing is, like, right after the war, I mean, there's about 10 years there where African Americans gain a lot of freedom all at once. African Americans get elected to positions in Congress. They become radical Republicans, and they vote on things like the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, what we're going to see is, and this is kind of like the reaction to that. So if you think about politics like a pendulum swinging back and forth, we've got slavery. We fight this major war, and suddenly the pendulum swings all the way over here, and we get all this like reaction to the war. We're going to make these 3 new amendments. And then eventually that pendulum's going to swing back the other way. And swinging back the other way becomes Jim Crow, and, you know, just laws to prevent African Americans from voting, laws that prevent, you know, segregate white Americans from Black Americans. And so, again, I just want to remind you, it's just kind of a step-by-step process. Okay, white Southerners were not eligible to vote. So this is how radical they got. So if you fought for the South, if you were a ex-soldier, you were not allowed to vote. And so what you end up getting is like almost the opposite. You have African Americans voting now, and then you have these white Southerners that had fought for the South that are ineligible to vote. And that's when you get things like the KKK that start. So white Southerners were not eligible to vote or chose to stay away from the polls. African Americans eagerly signed up to exercise their new right. No laws guaranteed the vote of African Americans in the North. That's kind of strange to me. So I guess there weren't laws in the northern states that guaranteed it. And then Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right that anyone could vote. All right, there they are. Okay. These guys have been labeled as a terrorist organization. Their mission and their goal is to terrorize African Americans or people that are non-white Southerners. And we see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during this time period. And it really goes from about the 1870s and almost reaches a height in the early 1900s. Eventually, the KKK become a fringe group by the 1860s. But I will say this, over the course of the decades and through the modern civil rights movement, we've seen a resurgence of right-wing groups. Now that we don't call them the KKK anymore, but the KKK is tied into some of them. And you have groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and neo-Nazis that, it's all become something that we call the alt-right. It's the alt-right movement, and it's growing. It's been growing really pretty heavily since Obama became the first African-American president. So the Congress passed federal laws making it a crime to use violence to prevent people from voting. So what the Klan does is they disguise themselves in these outfits so that they can't be revealed. And then they'll ride into white or African American settlements and lynch African Americans, shoot African Americans, and threaten to come back if the African Americans vote. All right. So they're using violence to prevent African Americans from voting. So the Klan activities lessened somewhat to the threat of violence persisted. Man, some of these kids have all kinds of typos in their slideshow, keeping many Southern Africans from the polls. That was their goal. All right, and there they are, burning crosses. Federal laws passed, making it illegal to use violence to stop people from voting. The Klan activities didn't continue very much, but when they did, they were still very violent. Yeah, I mean, they essentially what they're doing is they're intimidating Black people from voting. They're trying to stop a situation like what we had with Georgia, where the African American population of Atlanta, Georgia, came out and voted for Biden, turning the state blue. And what the Klan's objective was to prevent those people from coming out to vote. All right, so secret societies such as the Ku Klux Klan used violence against African Americans. A federal grand jury concluded the goal was to keep African Americans from voting. And notice they have the use of terror tactics. There's a really fascinating piece of history here because, I mean, if I just flip back to this picture of the Klan, these Klansmen were all white men. And they're trying to hide their identities so nobody knows who they are. And then they can perpetrate these acts of violence and then just go back to their regular lives. And they would go back to their regular life of being like a part of this town council or running the local, butcher shop or whatever. And nobody even knew that they were Klansmen, right? And there's another picture of him burning a cross. All right, freedmen rebuilds their lives. So formerly enslaved African Americans worked to carve out their lives in the South. More stayed in the South, but some did strike for the North and West part. They assembled their scattered families and communities, built churches, also used as a center for employment agencies, schools. In later years, it was a center of protest. So, the African American community through this find that they have to pretty much stick together. They have to stick together for solidarity. They have to stick together to fight for their rights. And this is where we get kind of the long process of where from the 1870s all the way up to the 1960s, almost 100 years of African Americans fighting court cases and protesting and just step by step, eventually gaining the equal rights that we all have. All right, Reconstruction comes to an end. After a decade of Reconstruction, Northerners began to lose interest in redoing the South and to focus on other social, political, and economic issues. Reconstruction began to fade after a series of bank failures sparked a severe economic downturn. In 1871, troops were withdrawn from the South. By 19, I think they mean to say 1872, Congress dissolved the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's it, guys. So that's one lesson from Reconstruction. I just thought maybe we could go over that a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and post this for you today. And then when we get back to school, we're going to have that debate. I think it'll be a fun debate. It is basically the debate is the rebel flag a symbol of racism or not? And so I haven't decided exactly how we'll do that, if we'll do a left, right, center, or if it'll just be like a kind of a discussion where we go around the room and people can share opinions, and then we'll take a survey maybe. So we'll do something like that. All right, guys, enjoy your snow day. Hope to see you on Friday, but if not, we'll meet again on Monday.